10 bottles of water sat on a stainless steel table under bright white light. And by the end of this investigation, only 3 of them would earn the right to call themselves clean. That number alone should stop you in your tracks, because bottled water is supposed to be the safe choice, the upgrade, the thing you grab when you don't trust the tap. It's a habit millions of people repeat every single day without a second thought, tossing a bottle into a cart or a gas station bag, assuming that because it comes sealed in plastic with a mountain or a glacier printed on the label, it must be pure. But purity, it turns out, is not something you can judge by a label, and today we're going to walk through exactly what happens when 10 of the most commonly purchased bottled waters in the country get sent to an independent lab and tested the way regulators rarely bother to test them. Before we get into the results, it helps to understand just how big this industry has become and how little most people actually know about what's inside the bottle. Bottled water has grown into a business worth tens of billions of dollars a year, outselling soda in many markets, marketed as the pure, natural alternative to everything else on the shelf. The packaging leans hard into imagery of untouched springs, snow-capped peaks, and pristine forests, even when the actual source is a municipal water system in an industrial suburb, filtered and repackaged under a name that sounds like it was bottled at the base of a glacier. That gap between the image on the label and the reality of the source is where the story really begins, because regulation of bottled water in most countries is surprisingly loose. It's classified as a food product rather than as drinking water infrastructure, which means it often escapes the same rigorous, continuous testing that tap water is required to undergo. Municipal water systems are typically tested multiple times a day for a wide range of contaminants, and the results are usually public. Bottled water companies, by contrast, are frequently only required to test a handful of times a year, and in many cases, the results never reach the public at all. So when a company puts a picture of a mountain spring on a label, there's often no independent authority checking whether that description bears any resemblance to where the water actually came from. With that context in mind, the lab in this investigation set out to test for the contaminants that consumers care about most, and that industry testing tends to gloss over. Microplastics, the tiny plastic fragments now found almost everywhere on Earth. PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals, linked to a growing list of health concerns because they don't break down in the environment or in the human body. Heavy metals like arsenic and lead, which can leach from source rock or from processing equipment. Bacterial contamination, which points to lapses in sanitation somewhere along the bottling process. And finally, a comparison between what the label claims about mineral content and source and what the water actually contained once it hit the analyzer. 10 products were purchased anonymously from ordinary retail shelves, spanning the spectrum from bargain private label water you'd find in a bulk pack at a discount store, to mid-range national brands, to the premium waters that charge several times more per bottle and lean heavily on the promise of superior purity. Each bottle was tested using the same methodology, the same equipment, and the same thresholds, so that no single product had any built-in advantage. The first and most attention-grabbing finding involved microplastics, and this is where the story gets uncomfortable because it turns out that the plastic bottle itself is part of the problem. Nearly every sample tested positive for microplastic particles, but the concentration varied dramatically from bottle to bottle. Some samples contained what researchers would consider a low background level, consistent with what's now found almost everywhere in the environment, from rainwater to remote mountain snow. Others, however, contained concentrations many times higher, and in several of those cases, the culprit appeared to be tied to the bottling process itself. Hot fill procedures, repeated handling, and prolonged storage in direct sunlight or heat all appear to accelerate the shedding of tiny plastic fragments from the container into the water inside it. The products that failed hardest in this category were, unsurprisingly, packaged in thinner, cheaper plastic, and had spent more time sitting in warehouse conditions before reaching the shelf. This alone was enough to disqualify several products from passing, because microplastic ingestion has become one of the most actively studied areas in environmental health. And while the science on long-term human effects is still developing, the working consensus among researchers is that minimizing unnecessary exposure is a reasonable precaution, especially for a product people consume daily by the liter. The second category, PFAS, produced some of the most concerning numbers in the entire test. These forever chemicals are used in everything from non-stick cookware to firefighting foam to industrial manufacturing, and because they don't degrade, they've worked their way into groundwater supplies across huge swaths of the country. A source drawing from an aquifer near industrial or agricultural activity is at meaningfully higher risk of carrying trace PFAS, and unless a bottler is using a filtration process specifically designed to strip these compounds out, that contamination simply gets bottled and shipped straight to store shelves. In this investigation, several products showed detectable PFAS levels, and while most fell under the newest regulatory guidance limits, At least 2 products exceeded them, meaning that a consumer drinking that brand regularly could be taking in more of these persistent chemicals than health guidelines consider acceptable. What made this especially frustrating is that neither of those 2 products disclosed anything about their filtration methods on the label, leaving buyers with absolutely no way to know that this risk existed before independent testing brought it to light. Heavy metals were the next area of focus, and here the picture was more mixed. Most of the 10 products showed only trace, harmless levels of metals like lead, arsenic, and cadmium, well within safety thresholds, which is genuinely good news, and a reminder that not every fear about bottled water is equally justified. However, one product, sourced from a spring in a region with known geological deposits of arsenic, showed a level that, while still technically under the maximum contaminant limit, sat close enough to the ceiling that repeated daily consumption over years could be a legitimate concern, particularly for children or pregnant women who are more vulnerable to cumulative low-level exposure. This is a good moment to point out that passing a legal threshold and being genuinely low risk aren't always the same thing. Regulatory limits are often set as a floor for acceptability, not a guarantee of zero risk, and companies operating right at the edge of that floor are making a choice about how much margin of safety they're willing to give their customers. Bacterial contamination was the 4th test. This is the category that felt the most like a basic quality control failure rather than an unavoidable environmental issue. 2 of the 10 products showed bacterial counts above what's considered acceptable for packaged drinking water, an indication of a breakdown somewhere in the sanitation chain, whether at the source during bottling or during storage and transport. Neither of these 2 products was a top-shelf, expensive brand. Both occupied that middle tier of national distribution where cost-cutting pressure on production lines tends to be highest and where the profit margin per bottle leaves little room for the kind of rigorous internal auditing that premium brands can afford to invest in. To be clear, the levels detected were not at a threshold likely to cause acute illness in a healthy adult who drinks 1 bottle, but for infants, the elderly, or anyone immunocompromised, this kind of contamination is exactly the sort of thing that responsible manufacturing is supposed to prevent entirely, and its presence at all raises real questions about what else might be slipping through on other production runs that weren't part of this particular test. Then there's the question of truth in labeling, and this might be the most quietly damning part of the whole investigation. Several products marketed themselves using language like natural spring water or glacier-sourced. Yet when the mineral composition was compared against known profiles for those claimed sources, the numbers simply didn't match up. In at least 2 cases, the mineral fingerprint was far more consistent with treated municipal tap water that had been run through reverse osmosis and had minerals added back in afterward, a process that is not inherently unsafe, but is also not what a customer paying a premium for spring water believes they are getting. This kind of labeling exists in a regulatory gray zone. The legal definitions of terms like spring water are technical and narrow, and companies have become skilled at using imagery, adjectives, and geographic-sounding brand names that imply a pristine origin without making a single legally binding claim that could be challenged. It's not illegal in most cases, but it is, by any reasonable definition, misleading, and it's a big part of why blind lab testing matters so much, because the story on the label and the story in the water are frequently 2 very different things. So which 3 passed, and what did they have in common? Without naming specific brands, the pattern across the 3 products that came through clean on every single metric: low microplastics, no detectable PFAS above trace background levels, clean heavy metal profiles, 0 bacterial contamination, and mineral content that actually matched what was printed on the label, was consistency of investment in the entire chain, not just the marketing budget. All 3 used more rigorous filtration steps, specifically targeting PFAS and microplastics. All 3 sourced from protected aquifers or municipal systems with strong existing water quality records. And all 3 published at least some testing data publicly, whether through a water quality report on their website or QR code on the bottle linking to lab results. None of the 3 were the cheapest option on the shelf, but interestingly, none of them were the most expensive either. The correlation between price and safety in this test was real, but not perfectly linear, meaning that paying more doesn't automatically buy you a cleaner bottle, and paying less doesn't automatically doom you to a dirty one. What actually predicted quality was transparency, and specifically, whether a company was willing to let independent, verifiable data speak for the product instead of leaning entirely on branding. It's worth stepping back here and asking the bigger question this whole investigation points toward: is bottled water actually worth it? Or is it mostly an expensive habit built on marketing rather than meaningfully better safety? The honest answer is nuanced. In places where tap water infrastructure is genuinely compromised, aging pipes, lead service lines, or contamination events, bottled water can be a real and important safety measure. And dismissing that need would be irresponsible, but for the enormous number of people buying bottled water purely out of habit or taste preference in places where the tap water is already well regulated and safe, this test is a pretty clear signal that the bottle isn't automatically the safer choice, and in 7 out of 10 cases here, it may have introduced risks that simply wouldn't exist with a well-maintained home filtration system and a reusable bottle. A quality carbon or reverse osmosis filter at home, tested and replaced on schedule, gives you more control and more transparency than almost any bottled product on a store shelf, because you can see exactly what's going into the filter and exactly when it needs to be replaced, rather than trusting a label and a logo. If there's one practical takeaway to leave you with, it's this. Stop assuming that the word natural, the picture of a mountain, or a higher price tag are reliable signals of safety, because this investigation showed clearly that none of those 3 things reliably predicted which products passed. Look instead for actual transparency. Companies that publish their water quality reports, that disclose their filtration methods, that welcome third-party testing rather than avoiding it. Check whether your local tap water utility publishes an annual water quality report, which in most cases it's legally required to do, and compare those numbers yourself. And if you do rely on bottled water regularly, consider rotating away from thin, cheap plastic bottles that have likely spent extended time in heat and sunlight during shipping and storage, since that appears to be one of the single biggest predictors of high microplastic contamination. Small choices like these won't fix an entire industry's transparency problem, but they will meaningfully reduce your own exposure while the bigger conversation about regulation and disclosure continues to play out. Because at the end of the day, water is the most basic thing we consume day after day for our entire lives, and it deserves a level of scrutiny that, right now, most of us have simply never thought to give it.